Hello everyone, just a quick clarification on the last video when I said that the American Revolution was not fought over taxes, and that I corrected myself and said not in the way in which we thought it was. There's a bigger video to be made about the reasons for the Revolutionary War. One of the reasons was taxation, but it wasn't the only reason. If you read the Declaration of Independence, which is our breakup letter to King George III, there's a lot more in there than just taxation. There's trial without jury. There's people being taken and tried out of the jurisdiction of the area where they lived. So lots of different issues. And of course, the big discussion amongst historians is, when did the Revolutionary War actually start? And I am of the opinion that the Revolutionary War, at least the seeds of what would happen and come to full bloom in 1776, was actually planted during the French and Indian War. A war that arguably George Washington did start by shooting the messenger. He shot a French messenger when he wasn't supposed to, and it started, it lit the match to the French and Indian War. George Washington was a social climber like Cinderella. And I'm not going to speak ill of the man. The man's a great man. I'm not going to take anything from him. You know, he had designs to be a great officer in the army. And when he realized that he couldn't reach the ranks that he wanted to reach because he was not born in England, after the French and Indian War, he leaves the military. He resigns from the army. And about that time, he meets Martha Custis. George Washington is not gentry. And there's only two ways that you get into gentry. You're born into it or you marry into it. George Washington was not gentry. But when he meets Martha Custis, Virginia's richest widow, he marries into gentry. And so that's how he gets into gentry. So there are different classes. You have your lower class, your lower middle class, your upper middle class. You have gentry, and then you have royalty. And again, you're either born into royalty or, as we see with Meghan Markle, you can marry into it. Of course, it's not that common, especially in the actual royal family. But so when today we say ladies and gentlemen, we use that as a general term for everybody based on gender. Men are gentlemen, women are ladies. But in the 18th century, and even in England today, these are separate, distinct classes. So for example, I have to work for a living. I am a woman. I will never be a lady unless I marry a gentleman. A gentleman is a wealthy man who does not have to work with his hands. That's a gentleman. So I wasn't born into gentry. The only way I would be able to get into gentry is I would marry into it. A man works with his hands. He's a laborer. So even if he's a tradesman and he's very wealthy and makes a lot of money, that will not put him into the gentry class because he works with his hands. A gentleman doesn't have to work with their hands. And then, of course, your middle class and your lower sorts. Self-explanatory, we have those today. So those are the different classes. And, of course, we exclude royalty in this country. We kicked them all out in 1776. I say that the seeds of revolution were planted during the French and Indian War because Parliament needs to find a way to pay for that war. They're broke. The war broke them. The French and Indian War broke them. So they need to pay for the war. The English people, the people in England, say, we are the Tea Party. We are taxed enough already. Make these Americans pay for their own defenses. We sent our military over there to defend them, to defend their land and their interest in gaining land westward on that continent. Make them pay for their defenses. So Parliament says, okay, well, we can't pass any taxes here to pay for this war over there, so we're going to tax the colonists to pay for their war, for their protection. They need to pay for their own protection. So Parliament goes to the individual legislative bodies of every colony and says, please, will you raise taxes to pay for your defenses? And each and every legislative body agrees and sends more money than they were meant to pay. But England is happy, we're all happy, and we're British ever after. Wrong. That did not happen. That's how it should have happened. That's called procedure. Parliament did not respect procedure. Parliament decides to bypass the king, by the way. The colonies fell under the, as we understand our government today, the colonies would fall under the executive branch of government under the constitutional monarchy, which means that we fall under the strict authority of the king. But Parliament bypasses the king and imposes the Stamp Act. That's the first tax that they impose in 1765. And of course, Benjamin Franklin is an ambassador over in England, and Parliament actually sits Benjamin Franklin down, and they examine him. It's called, and there's a pamphlet called The Examination of Benjamin Franklin, where they sit him down and they ask him if the Americans would mind paying this tax. And Ben Franklin says, oh, they'll grumble a little bit, but they'll pay for it. They'll pay it. Well, he was wrong. So Colonel John Mercer, who paid for the French and Indian War, he financed the war. So Colonel Mercer is a hero of the French and Indian War, okay? He's a hero. He goes over to England to be reimbursed for his costs. And they tell the Colonel Mercer, you know what, bud? We don't have the money to pay you, but we have this really great position. It's called stamp agent. And what you're going to do is you're going to distribute stamped papers throughout the colony of Virginia. And this is a great commission because you do your job well, you can be knighted for this. Well, there's never been an American knighted before. So, I mean, this is a great honor. So the colonel takes that commission. And in one of the buildings that I work at is the scene of where John Mercer is accosted by the gentlemen in Williamsburg who are meeting at the end of October 1765 in the exchange, and they practically beat this man. And if it wasn't for the governor, Governor Fauquier, sitting on the porch of Mr. Charlton's coffee house, calling the colonel over to him, only that stopped the men from attacking the colonel. And the colonel ended up resigning his commission. And there's a boycott of the stamped paper. So there's no stamped paper in the colonies. Nobody is able, the newspapers are unable to print the newspapers because they have no stamped paper. The courts are shut down. So we have a government shutdown and judicial shutdown because there's no stamped paper to record proceedings or cases and outcomes of cases. There's no marriage licenses. Not that you technically needed a marriage license to get married in Virginia, but you could have one if you needed a quick, I need to get married really quick, or a shotgun wedding, what we call it. Then you could have a marriage license. There's other ways that you would typically get married. And so it's a huge inconvenience. You can't buy decks of cards for gambling. You can't buy dice. In fact, in the 41 pages of the Stamp Act, if you read it, you'll see that the package of dice, that the tax is more than the actual dice are. So you're paying more in the tax than you are in the dice. But the problem is that we have local government. In Virginia, it's Williamsburg, the House of Burgess. In other colonies, in their capital, sits their elected officials. And through your vote, you give your elected officials the right to impose taxes upon you. Well, Parliament bypassed that. That's where we get no taxation without representation. Our representatives were not consulted on this tax to pay for the war. And so, we don't have anyone sitting in Parliament. Now, eventually what Parliament will do is they will offer the colonies to have representatives go and sit in Parliament to give us representation in Parliament. And we say, no, not going to happen. No, not going to happen. We can't send a representative 2,000 miles away to represent us, because then they're not representing us. How do they know what we need 2,000 miles away? That's not effective representation. So we don't want representation in Parliament. One of my favorite stories is of the tax distributor, I think in Connecticut, where the protesters actually went to the home of the stamp agent, ripped him out of bed in the middle of the night, dug a hole, asked him if he wanted to resign. He refused. They put him in a box, nail it shut. Plan to resign? No. Lower the box into the ground. Plan to resign? No. Start putting dirt on the coffin. Plan to resign? Yes. That's one of my favorite stories. There's other stories of men having to hold candles up under, and if they dropped the candle, it would burn a rope, and it was a noose. And if they dropped their arms, the carriage that they were they'd be stood on a carriage holding up these candles with a noose around their neck, and if their arms slipped, it would somehow cause the carriage to go out from under their feet. So, I mean, in Massachusetts, they tore their stamp distributor's house down board by board and took the boards with them. So there was some creative protests. Richard Henry Lee, I don't really mean to bring this up, but he actually wanted to be the stamp agent. Then when he found out he didn't get the position, he really fought against the Stamp Act. Some might call that sour grapes. Poor Richard Henry Lee. But, June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee, he presents the resolution to the Continental Congress for independency. And Richard Henry Lee, in 1774, helps to spearhead the idea of a Continental Congress. So the Lee family in Virginia, I think there's some political issues as to why this family has dropped off the earth in history. But that they are a family worth remembering, not just Robert E. Lee, different century, not my century. I'm 18th century. He's 19th century. Richard Henry Lee is 18th century. That's my Lee. But also the women in the Lee family were very progressive, believed in education, believed in women's rights. You can best believe that they had their input to the Lee men. Trust me, they were educating their slaves when they were not supposed to be in the 19th century. In the 18th century, it's not illegal to educate your slave. We have the Bray School, which educates black children regardless of whether they're free or enslaved. It's a philanthropic effort, and there's only, I believe, 5 Bray schools in the colonies, and 2 of them happen to be in Virginia, one in Williamsburg, and I believe the other one, don't quote me on this, is Fredericksburg. I think there's one in Philadelphia, because it educates black children regardless of whether they're free or enslaved. It's not until you start having rebellions spearheaded by educated slaves that it becomes illegal to educate your slave. So just another aside there. But anyway, so just, you know, a little bit on taxation. Of course, once the Stamp Act is repealed and they figure out this isn't working, we get William Pitt, the first minister. He actually rises from his sickbed and speaks for about 2 or 3 hours against the Stamp Act. We have Edmund Burke in Parliament who's speaking against the Stamp Act. Who one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence will actually quote him, Edmund Burke, as to why they're signing the Declaration of Independence. Is that a representative owes their constituents not just their, that they owe them their judgment. I don't have the quote in front of me, and I don't remember the exact quote, but it's a really great quote. Because the colony of Georgia, the people were against independency, and their representatives voted in favor of independency, which had to be a unanimous vote. But again, I'm going to go over these videos. I can go over time just talking about all of these things. But they repealed the Stamp Act, we find out, in June of 1766. But right behind that, Parliament puts out the Declaratory Act, which states that we in Parliament reserve the right to tax the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So to me, they're saying, okay, we're repealing this because we lost this battle, but we're going to save face and say, but we can still do this. So, we can still do this. And there's more taxes to come that they impose. They don't go through the king. They don't go to our elected officials. And that's the problem. And so that's why for a long time, and that's why you see when we are doing redresses to England, we are addressing the king because we fall under the king's authority, not Parliament, not the House of Lords, not the House of Commons. We fall under King George III. And so that's why we keep petitioning the king, and the king keeps telling us to buzz off. He's got other things to worry about. He's got an empire to run. He has to decide whether sugar's more valuable or tobacco's more valuable. So again, that's just the beginning, but there's many, many more abuses to come. Quartering soldiers, declaring martial law, and Patrick Henry will bring those issues up in his Liberty or Death speech in 1775. But again, I could do an hour on this topic, so I'm going to end it here. Have a good night. Merry Christmas.